Welcome to episode 7 of the Breaking Bio podcast, take 2. I'm your host, Stephen Hamblin, and today is October 17th, where we are. And I'm joined today by a full house of co-hosts, starting with our newest member on the left, Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren Reid, a recently escaped PhD student currently living in Glasgow.
Hi, I'm Michael Hawkes. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter in the UK.
Hi, I'm Morgan Jackson. I'm a PhD student in entomology at the University of Guelph in Canada.
Hi, I'm Rafael. I'm a PhD student at the University of Akron, Ohio.
Hi, I'm Tom Housley. I'm a PhD student at the University of Stirling in Scotland.
Excellent. And we are joined today by not only our new co-host, Lauren, but a special guest, Rob Brooks. Rob is the author of the book Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll. And we can do the cover shots here.
Again.
Shut it. Excellent. And he's also a behavioural ecologist here at University of New South Wales, a colleague upstairs from me. So, welcome, Rob.
Thanks for having me on the show, guys.
All right. Well, it didn't sound like you said that before at all.
Thanks for sticking around to actually do the show, Rob.
Yeah, now I'm going to be the one giggling.
For the listeners at home who have no idea what we're talking about, we were 15 minutes in and I forgot to start recording the damn thing, so I look like an idiot today.
More so.
Podcast's not going to make that any worse.
Thanks, Rob. I hate to do this to you again, but for those of us who haven't read the book, can you give us an overview?
Yeah. The main point of the book really is that evolution is important. In a way, it's a book about what the world looks like from the point of view of an evolutionary biologist. And part of the inspiration came from reading some of the popular behavioural economics books that are out there, where really, they're explaining things like as simple as people respond to incentives. If you look at Freakonomics, that's the main message of it. And really it's just saying this is what the world looks like from the point of view of an economist. We know a lot about what the world looks like from the point of view of the economist. There's economic news on most newscasts every day. It's in the papers every day, but we kind of get a very canned, stereotyped view of what evolutionary biologists think about the world and think about modern phenomena. So I wanted to explore the modern world, the world that we all inhabit, the things that we all care about, from the point of view of evolution, understanding that there's more to things than survival of the fittest and imperatives to go out there and mate, and et cetera, et cetera. And whether I did it with any success, time will tell, I suppose. But it was a lot of fun writing, and that was part of it as well. Just to have a bit of fun.
And so in our inadvertent pre-show, Morgan raised a good point.
Yeah, it was a good point then, and I think it'll be a secondly good point now. So I was mostly curious, because we didn't finish the answer. It was halfway through the answer when we realized that screwed. So I'm curious how somebody who studies insect sex for a living ended up writing a book about human sex. And as somebody that works with insects, I would be just as interested in reading a book about insect sex. So. Okay.
Basically, the answer that I have to that is that we all get into science for different reasons. Many of us feel a desire to be very socially useful. I never felt that desire particularly strongly. I just wanted to study things I was interested in, and I was interested in evolution because it's one of those bodies of theory that allows us to expose what it means to be alive. And that works whether you're studying insects or guppies like I did for my PhD, or mice like we do in my lab at the moment. Most of our experiments at the moment are on mice, or humans. And I've also, when you write your grant proposals, you have to sell it in certain ways, and the current flavor du jour is to sell it in terms of climate change or something like that. I don't tend to do that. I tend to prefer to grab the reader and the grant reviewer with questions that are about what it means to be human. And you can explore what it means to be human by doing experiments on other animals. Of course, it doesn't always extrapolate, perfectly, and you have to have certain reservations about it. But at the same time, what compels people to be interested in insect sex is often the trying to relate to these, bizarre, very different lives that insects live, but you relate in a way in human terms. So it gives us a chance to explore the variety of what it means to be alive and how individuals live their lives. So that's what I find interesting. So and now we do a lot of research on humans in our lab as well.
So the book covers a fair variety of topics. You've got everything from obesity to romantic love to sex conflict and straight to music. What motivated this selection of topics? Was it just stuff you were interested in, or is it,
I wasn't sure I could write 100,000 words, straight up on a particular topic on a single point. I just didn't know if I had that in me. So this is very much an experimental exercise, and so I picked a bunch of topics that I thought were interesting that we could explore. There were a bunch more. I had about 13 possible chapters. This is about 7 of the original chapters, some of which have been split because they were just too big and they sort of gravitated into multiple subjects and stuff. So I had questions about religion, for instance, that you can write books and books and books about that and still not even touch sides. And so I think wisely decided to leave that for another time, but also because there's a lot of very good books on that out there at the moment. So I guess it's an attempt to get at this piece by piece, chapter by chapter, and then try and put it together.
Well, I could question you about the book all day, but before we move on to insect sex, because I can see Tom squirming over there, anybody else have any questions for Rob about the book?
So I have a question. I don't know. It doesn't relate directly to the book, I guess. But so you said that your lab now is doing research on humans as well, right?
Yep.
So was that motivated by things that you found out while you were researching for the book? Is it things that you already had in mind before? Like how does your research interact with writing this book?
It's a really good question, actually, because so part of the writing of the book, in multiple motives, but part of the writing of the book was I decided, now's the time to do this thing that I've always wanted to, and to explore in the popular sphere these ideas. And in the basic writing of the book, I now have 3 academic papers that have come directly out of researching those subjects. One was on exactly that question of the price of foods and the price of carbohydrates. Another was on why women are at much greater risk of being obese, particularly in developing nations. And I went and did a sort of cross-national study and got some data. None of that story appeared in the book, but it was totally inspired by the business of writing the book. So you do, when you're writing, start to see low-hanging fruit all over the place, and it's possible to go out and pluck some of that and get papers. And because most of the stuff in my lab is big teams of people working, postdocs who are really running the show and directing the research, there are very few opportunities for me to write papers that are just me writing a paper, like in the olden days. And so here was a chance for me to do that, which was quite a lot of fun. I could gather data. I did a bit of field work. Steve knows I'm notoriously bad in the field, and I did a bit of field work which involved going down to McDonald's and trying to write down the prices. And it's impossible to write the prices down without actually going up to the counter. The prices are really small, which is really interesting to me. I'm not sure why that's the case. So I looked like a weird stalker dude taking notes. And then when I got too embarrassed to do that inside, I went out to the drive-thru and took some more notes of the prices. And the dude came over the radio and was like, "Could you please move along now? You're scaring the customer." So, and the third paper that I've written is about Asia's missing women, this tragic issue of sex-biased abortion particularly in India and China. It's most notable there because, of course, those are the most populous countries where this happens. But it's an area that behavioural ecology has a lot to say in terms of why would parents favour children of one sex over the other. There's, Trivers-Willard and local resource competition theory that can be applied there, as well as the consequences of it. What happens in a society when there are too many men? sociologists have kind of got a handle on it, but there's a complete lack of a Darwinian understanding of that. And so you can bring that in and talk about the work of evolutionary psychologists like Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, and apply that to what's happening in China and India right now, and what's going to happen over the next 3 decades as all those excess boys mature.
I actually noticed that about the book when I was reading it the first time. You mentioned evolutionary psychology, and I was impressed that you managed to kind of walk the line, avoiding some of the more exuberant evolutionary psychology you see. I'll use the euphemism exuberance, and still drawing in the actual evolutionary biology. But because people have a hunger for this, right? Like they want to see these things applied, but some of it hasn't always been that great.
Well, I think that's a really interesting topic, because evolutionary psychology, if you go to an evolutionary psychology conference, I went to the Human Behavior and Evolution meeting in Albuquerque last June, and there's some great science that is being done there. Evolutionary psychology, I think, is a really, really dynamic field, full of fantastic science. But I think partly because there is such a hunger out there in the public sphere for an understanding of why we do what we do, and why we do those kind of things that aren't intuitive and that don't necessarily make sense if you're talking about conscious, rational decision makers. A lot of the looser stuff tends to float to the surface of the public consciousness. So, sociobiology got that back in the 70s, and I think a lot of people sold out on sociobiology partly because the sensationalist stuff they just didn't want to be associated with. But there was a lot of great sociobiology being done back in the day, and I think the same thing's true, and the same thing's happening in evolutionary psychology right now, because evolutionary psychology is starting to get that same kind of almost epithet-like quality that used to be applied to sociobiology, because it is possible to sneer at a lot of that work. But remember that the creationists are also sneering at that work, and the fundamentalists, and all sorts of conservatives. So, I think we kind of have a responsibility with evolutionary psych to pick out the good stuff and talk about the good stuff and explore it in its complexity, and not just jump into the soundbite-like stories that can be digested in 150 words or less.
Or 140 characters.
Yeah, well, that's true too. You're the man who tweets as behavioural, my man, so great power comes great responsibility.
Hey, I saw a niche and I went for it. When I joined Twitter, there was nobody on Twitter talking about behavioral ecology. It was a dead zone, honestly. But
all right, I think that fits into 140 characters. I'm going to just write that down.
All right, so Tom, you're going to have to represent insect sex. Go.
Well, I had a non-insect question for Rob first. So I know that before you worked a lot on multivariate sexual selection, crickets as well as guppies. And I think I'm right in saying that you're doing stuff like that in humans now as well with your body lab work. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, thanks for mentioning Body Lab. So bodylab.biz is a website you can go to and look at and rate the attractiveness of some sort of slightly alien-looking grey bodies. What we've tried to do is strip all racial and cultural identifiers from these bodies and get to boil it down to the body itself. But what the phenotype, an organism, really, it can't be reduced to a single trait. And if there were a theme of the work that we've been doing here in my lab for the last decade or so, it's that evolution doesn't ever operate on a single trait at a time. It's complicated. It fluctuates, but it also operates on the interaction between traits. It doesn't pay to be small and incredibly aggressive, because you're not going to win any of those fights that you start. But big and aggressive, well, that's kind of okay. That might be a good way to go about things. Small and perhaps a little bit smarter and good at avoiding fights, that's not a bad combination. So you can see how combinations of traits can be selected, where other combinations of traits might not be selected. So the human body is a great example of that. If you look for the science in the serious journals like Cosmo and Vogue, You know, you look for the odd 140 word or 140 character stories about the science of attractiveness, and really it's about, you know, faces signal good genes, and so attractive people are going to be really good at having genes that avoid parasites. Now, in behavioural ecology, I think, you know, you couldn't get away with talking like that about any other organism, yet this is sort of seen as almost doctrine, that the certain dimensions of the face signal this one dimension of fitness. And similarly with the body, it's all about the waist-hip ratio. A waist-hip ratio of 0.7 is optimal for fertility. And, you know, I'm not so sure about that, and I'm not so sure that the links that get us to that point have been suitably demonstrated. But also, I think that there's much more than a ratio to a person's body. It's possible to have a 0.7 waist-hip ratio and look disproportionate in other areas. And it's possible to have a very well-integrated body that's overall slender or that's overall more curvaceous. I'm talking here about women's bodies, but there's a similar doctrine about waist-hip ratio or shoulder-to-waist ratio in men. So what we're doing is we're exploring the bodies that can evolve in about 30 different dimensions at once. And that's been a lot of fun. It's very difficult to do and to write up, as I'm finding right now. But what we're finding is that there are all sorts of combinations of traits that work. There's more than one way to make an attractive body. What really matters is the combinations. And so that's, you know, coming exactly out of methods that we developed to look at cricket songs. Methods that Tom's supervisor was intimately involved in developing, actually.
But another issue that I've had with evolutionary psychology, which I'd love to get your opinion on, is that most of the arguments in evolutionary psychology are, of necessity, essentially comparative, right? You know, we're looking at, you know, arguments from the way evolution has worked in animals and extending it to humans in some way, right? Because in the end, what we would like to do is to look at some trait and assess its fitness. Assess its fitness consequences, I should say. But we can't do that in humans for obvious reasons, you know, until there's a really permissive ethics board somewhere. So I'm wondering...
Careful. This has been tried before, people. This didn't go very well then.
But I'm wondering what you think about this. Is a field like evolutionary psych ultimately limited by the fact that we have no way to go to the gold standard and assess, you know, the actual fitness outcomes of these things?
Well, I think even if we did go to the gold standard, you know, this is where a proper integration with culture is really, really important, because evolution by natural selection is inherently just a banal historic byproduct. You know, what happened, happened. Who bred in the past, bred in the past. We're in the midst of the most rapid sort of self-induced change in environment that any species has probably ever wrought upon itself, and that's only going to accelerate. So even if you were to, I think there's a merit in exploring the relationship between traits and behaviors and fitness today, but it's only a limited merit because, of course, what we're really interested in is why do we have the genes that we have as a consequence of the relationship between fitness and those traits back in the environments that our ancestors have faced, which might be the Pleistocene. And I think one of the things that evolutionary psychology did after the sociobiology business, one of the things they did that was very good was they said, let's focus only on the things that all humans have in common. We want to understand if there is a common human nature. Let's imagine the environment before humans left Africa. Okay, now that proposition of who left Africa when and how many times and who mated with whom, etc., is way more complicated today now than it was back in the 1980s. But there's a lot to be said for imagining the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness as being Pleistocene savanna of Africa. I think that they still tend to imagine it as being too uniform, because it's a very variable place, Africa, now, and it probably always has been. And humans inhabit a variety of different environments. Since then, of course, a lot of changes have been have happened in response to agriculture. And changes are happening now and have been for a couple of generations in relation to industrialization and globalization. And now, in the Anthropocene, we will have all sorts of other changes. So the relationship between traits and fitness need not be all that simplistic, and it's not just about the selection that's happening here and now. We also have to have this historic science that explores the historic relationship between environments and adaptiveness. And I think between the variation in environments that our ancestors have faced and the enormous capacity for phenotypic plasticity that we have as a species, we must be the most phenotypically plastic species there is. And that's what behavior is, that's what language is.
So you're kind of touching on, I don't want to be too technical, but Leyland's definitions of adaptation versus adaptive. Traits that were selected in the past for a particular adaptive benefit as opposed to ones that are currently selected for their increment in fitness now.
That's right. I don't think there's any reason to believe that the way in which we respond to the social circumstances we find ourselves in, etc., is deeply maladaptive, but I think some of those ways is going to be maladaptive, and I think those maladaptive unintended consequences are what we're seeing in the obesity crisis, for instance. The business of being, we are adapted to a historic diet, and so, for instance, are we maladapted to other things? Are we maladapted to living in smaller groups than we live in now, to a kind of moral psychology that worked differently from the way that the modern world works? I think we can explore these things, but to do that, we have to take apart this idea of evolution as being this sort of monolithic, uniform thing. If you ask people to draw what the human ancestor was 100,000 years ago, people who had a reasonable idea about evolution and had watched a few Nat Geo programs and were willing to accept that that wasn't when we were, cohabiting with Behemoth the dinosaur, then you would find, I just put that in so that creationists could find it on their search engines. You would find that we would converge on a very similar kind of picture of what that ancestor looked like and what it did. And I think that human experience is probably much more various than we give ourselves credit for.
All right. Well, I'm not letting this go until somebody gets into a discussion on cricket sex. So one of you better take the lead here.
I was going to forego cricket sex for this one time, especially because I had Nathan Bailey visiting Stirling yesterday, so I wanked off a cricket for him in the early hours of yesterday morning.
Your cricket sex has been satiated for the next couple days, eh?
Yeah, for a little bit. But we generally like to chat about insect genitalia, and I noticed, Rob, that you had a paper recently with Louis Cayetano about seed beetle genitals. So you could tell us some more about that if you like.
Please.
Thanks for that, Tom. That's the hardest question I've faced. I think the diplomatic answer is you should ask Louis about that. That's so long ago that he did that. I mean, Louis has left here about 2 years ago. So, the slow publication cycle. I can't remember exactly what happened.
And if you think we're cutting that, you're sadly mistaken.
I haven't revisited it for some time. I would need to brush up on the figures.
I just shot my own career into flames there.
Tom's going to have a mysterious enemy for the rest of his career.
I think Louis would be very pleased to hear that his paper's been discussed on the internet, but I think it would do a disservice to not let Louis explain it at length.
All right, well, I guess cricket sex is off the table then.
Seed beetle sex, that's a different thing.
Right, sorry.
Cricket sex is always on the table with this group.
There is a great slide. I don't know if you've ever seen Alexei Maklikov, who used to be a postdoc and, in fact, was the guy who got Louis onto working with seed beetles. But Alexei when he was here, he had this wonderful slide because he would continually get reviews back that said, "Oh, this is all very well, Dr. Maklikov, but what do these seed beetles do in the wild?" And so, and in the field, and Alexei would tear his hair out with frustration because, of course, seed beetles have been domesticated ever since people have stored dried seeds, and all of the seed beetle cultures are essentially working with animals that are adapted to living in these very high densities of seeds in dry storage associated with human activity. And most of the lines are very, very well lab adapted. And so what we can really understand by studying something in the lab, we can understand how an organism functions in the wild, because the lab is the wild and the wild is the lab. And so one day he got a bunch of seeds and seed beetles and he put them in a jar, and he put the jar amongst some wildflowers out in the field, and he took pictures and said, "Seed beetles in the field." And I think that makes the point better than anybody else could.
Oh, all right. Well, anybody else have some questions for Rob? The panel has been remarkably silent on this one.
Well, I picked up, as I was thinking, getting back to the kind of how we run this podcast. Did you say that that Tom's advisor is doing a bunch of stuff with the sexiness of faces?
No, there's a colleague in psychology at Tom's University, Tony Little. Do you know Tony, Tom?
No, I know the name. I've been to a couple of the evolutionary psychology department talks, but they tend to lock out anyone who's studying actually evolutionary biology.
I know Tony.
Okay.
Lauren did her master's there, so she can maybe
I know Tony all the time.
Okay.
I was just curious if that's how Tom got hired as a PhD student. That's all. Whether he was like a case thing, I don't know. Sorry.
Oh, so we're working up to a long, circuitous insult.
I've been waiting on that one for like 10 minutes now, so yeah.
You just pretty much nailed the whole tone of the podcast. It's just one long, circuitous insult.
Oh, fair enough.
Don't we get a cut from extra sales of Rob's book?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so we generated, 3 sales? So that's 10 cents for the podcast?
No, I think that comes down to about 60 cents for the podcast.
Oh.
I'll bring it down
Nice.
after we finish recording, all right?
All right.
Thank you all.
Yeah,
We're
you can just
rolling.
bring it down. You can just bring it down to me, Rob. I'll take care of it.
Sure.
Well, that was a
Off
nice
to
60
Mexico.
cents we never saw.
Yeah, well, I could buy a 60-cent microphone for Lauren and post it to her.
Rob learns quick.
I just thought she might need one. I would be fine.
Rob's insults are a little less long setup.
That wasn't an insult. That was an offer.
I was
Sounds familiar to the insults that we gave to Rafael on the very first episode, so it works. It's good.
Okay.
All right. So, do we have any other questions for Rob before we let him go here?
I wanted to ask Rob to speculate wildly on something.
That's what I'm good at.
I guess you've already touched on it a little bit, so I probably know your answer. But in recent years, there's been quite a few professors, like I think Steve Jones, who've put forward the notion that the human race has stopped evolving due to things like the healthcare and medicine that we have now. What do you think of that sort of notion?
Let me quickly take a poll in 140 characters or less. What do you think of that notion, or each of you?
Bullshit.
Thank you.
Bullshit.
I think we could all just say bullshit together.
Okay. I don't know.
I would say
I mean,
it's complicated. Yeah.
I haven't read the book.
I'd say
Whether or not- Sorry?
But I'm not sure how. I'd say bullshit, but I'm not sure how significant the evolution is.
Okay. That's fair enough. The thing about evolution is you don't always know what's happening while it's happening. That's kind of the nature of it. But whether those... I actually saw Steve Jones talk, and I saw him actually lay this thesis out. So I'd have to say that it's not an unfair kind of headline-grabbing portrayal. He really does believe that, and I just can't see how. As long as some individuals are having more offspring than others, and as long as some individuals are not having any at all, and as long as some individuals are not having any, relatives, and lineages are dying out and other lineages are being very productive, then there's going to be evolution by natural selection. I think that in the post-industrial societies, maybe the variance in fitness is lower than it was in hunter-gatherer societies, but we know that in agricultural pre-industrial societies, the variance in fitness was much, much higher than it was in hunter-gatherers, and than it is in most other primates. Virpi Lumar's group has got a wonderful paper out of one of their Finnish studies looking at what is the variation in fitness. If you've got variation in fitness, you've got an opportunity for selection. And if you've got an opportunity for selection, there are going to be traits that are going to be influencing it. So is evolution still happening right now? Well, are some people getting lots of matings and others not? I think they are. Are some people living long lives and others dying in childhood? Yes, maybe not the same way. So evolution, it's not the same kind of direction, but evolution's never really been about a single direction. It's more, to my mind, about integration of phenotypes. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, HIV alone, just one simple dimension, is probably exerting incredibly strong selection on people to, from everything from behaviors and physiological mechanisms that reduce the probability of infection through to the capacity to fight off that infection and the capacity to still thrive while infected. So there alone is an example of something that's happening that's probably exerting really, really strong selection, some of the strongest selection that may have ever been exerted. So yeah, I would say I can't understand how Steve Jones comes to that conclusion and yet considers himself an evolutionary biologist.
We actually have signatures of recent selection, don't we? Like directional selection in something in the brain. I wish I could remember it's not a literature I'm very familiar with, but there are actual examples of it ongoing, isn't there?
But I mean, if I think of things that have happened in the recent past, one is the escape from hunger. So about 6 of the 7 billion people on the planet today have escaped from hunger. They're not, they're not at risk of malnutrition. There's still 1 billion people at risk of malnutrition. But for those 6 billion people, suddenly their bodies face the challenge of what to do when you've got enough to eat. Maybe you can't afford to eat well, but you can afford not to starve to death. And so people are eating badly. And so we have this obesity crisis that's emerging. Never before have large proportions of the population faced obesity. And so our bodies are not particularly good at that end of regulating that end of the metabolism that has to do with having too much. They're much better at avoiding starvation, and you can see we're very good at conserving energy, blah, blah, blah. And so one thing that seems to be happening is after the escape from hunger, very high proportions of women suffer from obesity-induced polycystic ovary syndrome. And this is truer, currently, this is truer in populations that have just escaped from hunger. They're 1 or 2 generations out, than in populations that, like most of us probably come from, where their ancestors escaped from hunger 5 or 6 generations ago. So if your ancestors escaped from hunger 5 or 6 generations ago, some of the contemporaries of your great-great-great-grandmothers were infertile because they put on too much weight and they had polycystic ovary syndrome, whereas your mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers probably managed to sneak through that. Whereas if you take sort of first-generation migrants from South India, transplant them to London in the UK, and where they've escaped from hunger, suddenly there's 50% of women have polycystic ovary syndrome at certain ages within the fertile period. So there's another area where genetic variation for all sorts of things to do with regulating the metabolism is probably under very, very strong selection right now. 500 years ago, almost nobody was reading. People, a few monks in a few monasteries read and copied manuscripts. But in the last 500 years, we've had this massive spread of reading. Reading's a really important determinant of whether or not you're going to be able to function in an economy, and in the future, it's going to be even more important, probably. Writing and writing legibly and using grammar may not be particularly important, but nonetheless.
Grammar as you know it.
The capacity to do this new thing, and when you're in a new environment, that tends to release, via genotype environment interaction, tends to release all sorts of new genetic variation. So I would treat with enormous suspicion any claims that the link between genetic variation and fitness has been somehow broken or tampered with. I would think that one could equally make the case that evolution might accelerate.
That was actually a really interesting example from your book. The part that really grabbed me, that section on the Pacific Islanders.
Yeah.
Can you just tell the people at home what's going on there?
Absolutely. So Steve Simpson and Dave Robenheimer have this idea they call it the protein leverage hypothesis, which basically, at its essence, says that we need about 14%, at least 14% protein in our diets. If we don't get 14% protein, then we overeat in order to compensate for that. The protein is the key to satiety, to feeling full and to stopping eating. So if we overeat, if we don't get 14% protein, for every kilojoule of protein that we don't get, we eat an extra 53 kilojoules of carbohydrates and fats in order to sort of shut our bodies up and tell them, it's okay, we've eaten enough. If we overeat protein, we eat an extra kilojoule of protein more than we need. We only undereat by about 11 kilojoules of carbohydrates and fat, which means that's why one of the reasons it's so much harder to lose weight than it is for many of us to gain that weight. But now, that set point, that 14%, you would expect to be tied to the history of selection on those populations that people come from. These are populations that have had agriculture for some time, probably for as long as 10,000 or 12,000 years. But let's say, most of their food has come from agriculture in the last 5,000 years. But what about populations that have never ever had subsistence agriculture, that are essentially living with a diet that's like a hunter-gatherer diet? Well, Aboriginal Australians, First Nations people in North America, and in fact Pacific Islanders. Pacific Islanders have fruit trees, etc., but most of their protein comes from lean fish that they've caught. They've gone out and done the work to catch it as well. So it may be that in those populations where people have traditionally consumed about 25% protein, that their set point for protein leverage is somewhat higher than that 14%. There's no direct evidence for this, but what we do know is that Aboriginal people whose ancestors have never been farmers, and Polynesians and Melanesians whose ancestors have never been farmers, are way more susceptible to obesity. So if you took the 10 most, or you took a list of the most obese countries in the world with the highest proportion of adult obesity, the 7 most obese countries in the world are all Pacific Islands. And the US only comes in about 12, and Australia comes in around about 25 or something like that. This is not a disease of wealth and of wealthy nations. It's a disease that first of all afflicts people who've never ever had farming ancestors, probably because their protein leverage is even stronger than the protein leverage that you or I face and that our genes impose on us.
And those Pacific Islands, they have startling obesity rates too. Like,
I think
you were
Nauru's
quoting
about
75% at the top.
Yeah. 80% of adults have a body mass index of over 30, and just about everybody else is overweight at least. You go to Samoa or Guam or Nauru or Micronesia, and the obesity just surrounds you. It really is quite depressing.
And this is a recent thing for them.
Sorry,
go ahead, Rafael.
So the argument there is that these populations have been evolving with a higher content of protein in their diet, and once they're exposed to carbohydrates, they intake that like a lot more.
Well, I think there's two aspects to it. One is that they probably need more protein in order to feel satiated than you or I do, because at least we have a history of at least encountering somewhat cheaper carbohydrates. But the other thing is they probably don't have the same metabolic capacity to handle the short chain carbohydrates and some of the dodgy fats as well. The US. Around about this time of year, people are eating Thanksgiving turkeys, and in other parts of the world they're having Christmas turkeys. There's this little part of the turkey called the turkey tail, which essentially is skin and fat, and it's not really edible. And there are two ways to monetize that little piece that you chop off in the factory. One is to sell it to pet food manufacturers, and the other is to sell it to people who want to cook with it. And in the Pacific Islands, basically, they've been importing these turkey tails and selling it as very, very cheap. It smells like protein. It tastes like protein. There is a bit of protein in that, but really it's all fat. And so there are some countries that have banned turkey tail and turkey tail soup, which has been a recent cultural explosion.
Yeah,
I'm not.
pointed out that there's a huge shift recently in the islands that this is a really recent thing for them, that they used to be all protein and now it's suddenly sold all their fish off to third parties, and now they're just importing carbohydrates.
They sell the fishing rights to Japan, and then they import tinned fish. They import turkey tails. They import bread and rice and all sorts of things that their bodies have never been used to processing and dealing with.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Michael.
So I was just going to say, I'm not familiar with the work on humans, but I know in crickets at least, males do better when they're eating more more carbohydrate-based diets, and females tend to do better when they're eating more proteinaceous diets. How do you think that might have affected any differences in humans? Does the protein point for males and females differ in these populations that are having big problems?
Well, that's something I've long wanted to do. When we did that, we did some of that work on cricket diets, and I think it's a really interesting question whether or not male and female diets fitness is optimized on the same diets. For cricket, we can certainly say, male crickets have to call, so you can see why they would need lots of carbohydrates. Female crickets need to make eggs, and those egg casings need to have protein in them, and the egg yolk has protein in it, so you can see why they would need protein. Whether or not human diets are optimized on slightly different ratios of macronutrients, hard to say. We do know, for instance, that micronutrients, men and women need different micronutrients. Women need more, folate supplements, etc., at certain times. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Although the investments that women make in reproduction are so starkly different from the kinds of investments that men make in reproduction. So, I think that's a question that's ripe for study, but very difficult to study. And I'm hoping Steve Simpson, he's got a big institute where they do this kind of stuff in a very cross-disciplinary way, and I'm hoping Steve will test that hypothesis with some of his studies.
Well, and just as we were talking there, it kind of dawned on me the correlation between what is considered one of the biggest, still untalked about, but one of the bigger cultural taboos is the whole smallpox introduction to North America, and the effect that it had on Native American populations. Do you see any correlation between that and what's happening in some of these other populations with the food that's being brought in by Western civilizations to some of these other populations that's essentially having the same effect of causing massive health issues?
I think that's a very interesting parallel that you draw there between the exporting of food that we know not to be particularly good and the exporting of smallpox to the New World. Now, whether one takes a conspiracy theory, intentional genocide view of the smallpox question,
yeah,
or
no,
not,
I definitely wasn't going there. I'm just meaning, bringing new pathogens in that have essentially the same effect. I'm not trying to insinuate that anybody's doing this on purpose.
That's a great paper title, though. Carbohydrates as a pathogen.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. I mean, I'd like to see a couple of postmodernists get onto that one too, just from the point of view of how they'd like to spin that one up. But yeah, I mean, at what point do you regulate that kind of market, or is an export market just a great thing? Americans used to be very proud of this idea that they'd never been to war with a country that had a McDonald's. I don't know whether that's true or not. They used to say that 10 years ago. But, one would have to ask why. Is the spread of fast food some kind of covert pacifying strategy? I'm not saying
Either
that's
that or they
true.
go to war to get McDonald's in. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's the whole reason. McDonald's.
Yeah.
It's not oil. It's McDonald's.
They did invade Canada twice, and we have McDonald's now. So
Not at the time.
yeah, well,
Canadians haven't managed to find a way to suggest that perhaps they invented McDonald's and it was just stolen?
We don't want that.
yeah, we're not taking credit for that.
Canadians won't own it. They won't own this problem they've inflicted
Nope.
on the US.
We'll apologize for most things, but not for that.
I think you'll have to take this podcast out with a little, broadcast of Blame Canada.
Blame Canada! Blame Canada!
Yeah, well.
It's still as fresh as it always was.
All right, well, I think we should kind of give it a wrap up here because we've been going for an hour plus change when I wasn't recording. And, all right.
An hour of functional time.
Well, thank you all, guys. It's really good to get a chance to talk about these ideas with behavioural ecologists and with folks who can ask intelligent questions and don't say, "Does this mean Darwin was wrong?" and which is the standard kind of interview fare one gets. So it's really entertaining for me to have a chance to talk to you. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm not going to lie, I'm
And our
massively
apologies to anybody
impressed.
who asked that question.
Thanks for coming.
This was pretty much the most on-the-rails podcast we've ever had so far. Lauren, don't get used to it. It gets a lot worse from
Because I
here.
can't talk. Wait till I get a mic, it's all going to fall apart.
All right.
Well, good
then,
luck with the podcast, guys. Keep it up.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks for
thanks for-
coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Rob. And
No worries, guys.
that's episode 7 of the Breaking Bio podcast, so we'll see you guys later.
Yeah.
Wave goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.